story begins with the sound of a phone crashing on the hospital floor as Arya stood frozen, her lungs refusing to breathe. The doctor's words kept replaying in her ears like a cruel echo that wouldn't fade. They said her mother's heart had stopped for almost 3 minutes before being revived, but her chances of surviving the next 24 hours were painfully uncertain. Morning sunlight was flooding through the long hospital corridor windows, bright and warm, yet Arya felt as if she were locked in a cold, collapsing world. At only 22, she had already tasted more loss than most people her age, and now she stood on the edge of another heartbreak that threatened to swallow her whole. Viewers of Ripple of Love, if you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more emotional stories like this. Arya had always carried her dreams quietly, like fragile paper birds she kept safe in a box no one else could touch. She worked part-time at a small roadside flower shop, filling people's happiest moments with color, even though her own life lacked it. Her father had died when she was 15, leaving behind the heavy silence of unspoken wisdom and unfinished love. Her mother became her only anchor, and losing her now felt like being pushed into a storm with no shore in sight. That morning, as she sat outside the hospital under the pale golden sky, she felt the weight of her loneliness more than ever. People passed by with hurried steps, some laughing, some frowning, all lost in their own worlds. And in that sea of strangers, her brokenness felt invisible. A few meters away, someone else sat in silence, staring at the same horizon with the same heaviness in his eyes. His name was Armin, a 25-year-old man with a face shaped by responsibility far earlier than life intended. The sunlight outlined the tired shadows under his eyes, shadows carved from years spent taking care of his younger brother after their parents' sudden accident. He had dreams too, big ones, but they had all been set aside the moment he signed the papers to become his brother's guardian at the age of 19. Armin had learned to carry the world on his shoulders without complaining, but somewhere along the way, he forgot how to carry himself. He came to the hospital that day for his brother's routine checkup. The boy had always been frail after the accident, his breathing weak, his heart fragile. Armin's life revolved around keeping him safe, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness day after day. But today, something felt different, a sense of heaviness sitting in his chest that had nothing to do with his brother's condition and everything to do with the haunting fear that life loved taking away the things he cherished the most. As he stepped outside, trying to breathe in the crisp morning air, he noticed Arya sitting alone on a bench, her hands trembling around her mother's medical file. He wasn't the type who approached strangers, but grief recognizes grief the way dusk recognizes night. Something in her stillness, too controlled, too quiet, pulled him in like an unspoken cry for help. He walked past her gently, trying not to disturb her space, yet something inside him refused to leave. He paused a few steps away, unsure if fate was pushing him or if loneliness had finally made him brave enough to care about someone else's pain again. Arya didn't notice him at first, her eyes were locked on the ground as if the earth beneath her held the answers to everything she couldn't fix. But then she heard footsteps pause nearby. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes were glazed with tears she hadn't allowed to fall. The sunlight made her look fragile and fierce at the same time, like someone holding on to hope even as the world tried to take it away. Armin felt something shift inside him, something he thought had died long ago, an instinct to protect, to comfort, to stand beside someone even without words. As hours passed, life kept weaving thin threads between them, small glances, subtle gestures, quiet acknowledgments of shared vulnerability. They saw each other again at the vending machine, then outside the waiting area, and later beside the fountain where Arya stood washing her face to hide the redness in her eyes. She didn't know why she let Armin hand her a tissue without hesitation. She didn't know why her shoulders relaxed around him, or why the storm inside her chest softened whenever he silently stayed nearby. And Armin didn't know why simply seeing her made his heart feel less heavy, as if her presence stitched back a part of him he had abandoned years ago. The days unfolded like soft ripples, slow, gentle, and quietly transformative. Armin began arriving early just to ensure Arya had someone to sit with. He learned how she used to draw small illustrations on the corners of her mother's medicine lists to reduce the sadness. He learned how she skipped meals when anxious, how she pretended to be fine even when she was breaking. And Arya learned that Armin's laugh was rare but beautiful, that he carried the burden of 2 lives with the strength of someone who had never been allowed to fall apart, and that behind his quiet eyes lived a boy who had grown up too fast. There was no confession, no dramatic moment, just 2 wounded hearts slowly building a bridge between their broken pieces. Their connection wasn't loud, it wasn't rushed. It was real, steady, and quietly irresistible. But life, as always, had its own ways of testing them. One evening, as the sun stretched into long shadows, Armin rushed into the hospital with terror gripping his chest. His younger brother had collapsed at school, and the doctors were uncertain about his condition. Arya saw him pacing in the hallway, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his composure shattered. For the first time, she saw the weight he carried without complaint. She walked to him silently, her presence steady and warm. Her hand brushed lightly against his, and for the first time in years, Armin allowed himself to lean on someone. Their worlds that had once run separately suddenly merged in the most vulnerable way, through shared fear, shared pain, shared hope. In a twist life had been quietly preparing, both their loved ones recovered in the same week. Arya's mother opened her eyes to a new dawn, weak but alive. Armin's brother finally stabilized and began showing signs of improvement. Relief washed over them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They realized they had survived the darkest moments not alone, but together. Just before the final emotional conclusion, dear viewers, please comment below what moment touched you the most in this story. Arya and Armin's bond deepened naturally, like a sunrise unfolding with gentleness. They didn't force love, they allowed it to bloom on its own, rooted in understanding, watered by shared pain, and warmed by moments that felt too pure to explain. They learned that 2 broken people do not complete each other, they learn to grow together. They learned that love isn't dramatic, sometimes it's just sitting beside someone who refuses to give up on life. They learned that healing doesn't come in waves, it comes in ripples, quiet yet powerful. And viewers of Ripple of Love, if this story touched your heart, please support it with your love and engagement. In the end, as the warm daylight glowed softly on their intertwined paths, Arya and Armin realized that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a hospital corridor, in shared silence, in trembling hands offering comfort, in broken hearts learning how to beat again. Love came to them not as a rescue but as a reminder: life may shatter you, but it will also send someone who knows how to pick up the pieces without ever asking why they broke. And that revelation, gentle yet profound, became the beginning of their forever. The days after their families recovered felt strangely calm, almost too calm, as if life was holding its breath before delivering another storm. Arya often found herself walking through the hospital garden even when she didn't need to be there, following the same stone path where she had once cried with shaking hands and hollow eyes. But now, the air felt different. The sunlight fell warmer on her skin, the breeze felt softer, and her footsteps no longer carried only fear, they carried something unnamed, something fragile that she was afraid to acknowledge. She wasn't ready to call it love yet, but it felt like the beginning of something that could change her life if she allowed it. Armin, too, found himself drawn to the hospital garden, even though his brother had been discharged days earlier. He didn't know why he kept returning, but perhaps deep down he knew the truth: the place no longer reminded him of fear, it reminded him of her. He would sit on the longest stone bench and watch the sunlight filter through the leaves, remembering the day Arya stood beside him when his brother's life hung by a thread. She had touched his shaking hands when the world was collapsing, and without a single word, she had held together the pieces he had carried alone for years. No one had ever done that for him. The garden became their quiet meeting point. Sometimes Arya would be reading her mother's reports, and Armin would sit a small distance away pretending he wasn't waiting for her eyes to lift. Sometimes he would bring a packet of biscuits because he noticed she always forgot to eat when stressed. Other times she'd bring him a small sketch, simple line drawings of flowers or sunlight or small symbolic things, and he would keep them folded gently in his wallet, as if they were pieces of hope he had finally earned. Neither acknowledged what was happening, but their hearts whispered it long before their lips ever could. Yet life rarely lets love bloom without testing it. One bright afternoon, as the sun glowed like molten gold over the hospital courtyard, Arya found a message on her phone that made her world tilt again. The hospital had called her for an urgent meeting regarding her mother's recovery. She rushed through the corridors, her pulse racing, her breath shallow, her fears rising like dark waves. When she entered the consultation room, the doctor explained her mother's improvement but also delivered a heavy blow. Her mother would need long-term therapy and daily support for the next 6 months. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was financially heavy, emotionally demanding, and far beyond what Arya could shoulder alone. She left the room with trembling hands, feeling the old loneliness returning like a familiar ache. She had fought so hard for stability, but life kept offering storms instead of calm. The sunlight outside looked almost mocking as she stood in the hallway, staring blankly at the polished tiles. She tried not to cry, but the tears gathered anyway, blurring the world into a haze of gold and sorrow. Armand saw her from across the corridor, the moment her shoulders sagged and her chest rose in a sharp, painful inhale. He didn't approach immediately. He didn't want to intrude. But then he saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand the way people do when they're trying to be strong for too long. Something in him cracked. He walked to her slowly, silently, unsure if she would allow him into her pain again. She didn't say anything when he reached her side, but her silence told him everything. Arya wasn't afraid of struggle, she had lived through enough of it. But she feared burdening someone she cared about. And she did care about Armand. That fear alone was bigger than the problem itself. Armand sensed her pulling away emotionally even if she didn't step back physically. He recognized the look in her eyes, the fear of attachment, the fear of becoming someone's responsibility, the fear of being left behind. He had felt it too many times in his own life. Over the next week, Arya began avoiding the garden where they always met. She spent her time between home and hospital, shutting herself away from everything that once gave her comfort. Armand noticed the absence immediately. The garden felt emptier, the sunlight less warm, the world slightly off balance. He waited every morning, telling himself he wouldn't stay long, yet he always did. And every evening he walked home with a heaviness he couldn't shake off. He tried calling her once, then twice, but she never answered. Not because she didn't want to, but because she feared letting him see her break again. One afternoon, as she sat outside the therapy center reading her mother's expenses, Arya felt a shadow fall beside her. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. She recognized his quiet presence the way she recognized her own heartbeat. Armand didn't ask why she had disappeared. He didn't scold her or question her silence. He simply sat down next to her, leaving a respectful distance, yet close enough for her to know she wasn't alone. She kept her eyes on the medical papers, but her vision blurred as tears silently escaped. The world around them continued its normal rhythm. Nurses walked past with charts, sunlight flickered across the tiled floor, a soft breeze moved through the open windows, but for a moment, everything stilled around them. Arya felt the familiar warmth of Armand's steady presence, the very presence she had been avoiding. She realized then that she didn't have to carry everything alone, that strength wasn't in doing everything by herself but in allowing someone to stand beside her. Armand gently offered his hand, not demanding, not expecting, just offering. The smallest gesture held an entire universe of reassurance. She hesitated only long enough for one tear to fall before placing her trembling fingers in his. The moment their hands touched, everything unspoken between them finally breathed. He didn't give her promises. She didn't ask for solutions. What existed between them was deeper than quick fixes or dramatic confessions. It was the quiet certainty that life had finally given them someone who understood their scars, someone who didn't walk away when things became difficult. Time passed differently after that day. Not dramatically, but softly, steadily. Arya learned to let Armin into her life one gentle moment at a time. Armin learned to trust happiness again, something he had long stopped believing in. There was no perfect day when love suddenly declared itself. It grew slowly, in shared walks, in quiet mornings, in hospital benches where they waited together, in small smiles exchanged through exhaustion, in sunlight warming their shoulders as they stood side by side. One warm afternoon, Arya looked at Armin and realized her life no longer felt like a series of battles she had to fight alone. And Armin looked at her and realized she had become the calm he never knew he needed. Their hearts didn't collide like lightning. They connected like dawn meeting the horizon, slowly, gracefully, beautifully. And that is how love finally settled into their lives, not as a rescue, but as a gentle unfolding.